December. One of the year in review lists that I enjoy looking at is the list of popular baby names. In 2013, the most popular girl's name was Sophia, and the most popular boy's name was Jackson. Parents agonize over what to name the baby. There are so many different things to consider. Should we give the baby a family name? Or shall we choose something unique? How are we going to spell the name? And how does the name sound when you say it all together? Because you know, it's not just the first and middle names that are important. The last name is important too. In fact, some would say the last name is the most important because it is the last name that gives the child its surest sense of identity. The last name is how we know what family that child comes from. The last name tells us who that child belongs to. My maiden name was Van Sickle. Now, in the city of Emporia, the name Van Sickle was not a name that had a lot of prestige or a lot of influence. But someone who had done some genealogical work for our family told us that if we lived on the East Coast and our name were Van Sickle, back on the East Coast, that name is actually very influential. If we had lived on the East Coast, we would have had much more influence and much more power than we had living in Emporia. Go figure. Well, this morning's scripture is a story about the power of names. And the main character in our story today is a man whose name was Joseph. There are actually two Josephs of importance in the Bible. One is in the Old Testament, one is in the New Testament, and they have some things in common besides just their name. Both of them were named Joseph. Both of them were visited by an angel. And both of them wrestled with their faith and with their relationships with God and with their family. Many of us wrestle with those things. We wrestle with some of the parts of the story of the Nativity. I mean, a virgin birth? Really? Angels and shepherds and wise men and a star? Really? And of course, some of us have difficulty during the Christmas season because that is a time for families to come together, and sometimes those family dynamics are difficult. So if you are wrestling with your faith or with your family this Christmas season, well, you are in good company. So did both of the Josephs in the Bible. Now, the Joseph in today's story was in a very bad situation. You see, he was betrothed to a woman whose name was Mary, and as it turns out, she was pregnant. Now, in order to understand how difficult that was and exactly what Joseph's dilemma was, I think it's helpful for us to understand the convention of marriage at this time, because it was different from the way it is today. What would happen in the days of Joseph and Mary is that two families would come together and they would enter into a contractual agreement that this family's daughter would marry this family's son. Many times the bride and the groom had never even met. This was not a matter of decision for individuals, and it had really nothing to do with love. This was a contract between two families. And in that moment, when the two families agreed that this daughter and this son would become married, the couple was essentially married. They were legally, contractually husband and wife. That is what it meant to be betrothed. But after the families had entered into this contract, there would be a period of time where the bride and the groom did not live together. They would not actually live together for up to 1 year. And one of the reasons for doing that was to ensure that the bride was chaste, to ensure that she was not already pregnant by someone else. Because for her to marry would have brought shame upon both families. Well, that is the situation where Joseph and Mary were. Their families had apparently already entered into this contract. They apparently already were legally married, but they were not yet living together. And lo and behold, Mary was pregnant. Now, Joseph had some options. There were things he could do. Joseph could have demanded compensation for this act. Joseph could have brought public shame upon Mary. He could have made a big public deal out of this and let everybody know that Mary was pregnant and that he wasn't the father. And that would have brought shame upon not only Mary, but upon her whole family. And in making this big public spectacle of this, Joseph would have kind of separated himself from that so that he and his family would have retained their honor. They would have lost nothing in terms of their reputation and their honor, and all the fault would have been on Mary and her family. That's what Joseph could have done, and that's frankly what Joseph would have been expected to do. But Joseph wrestled with that decision. And we imagine him lying awake at night and tossing and turning and being so angry at this apparent deception. And yet at the same time, caring something for this woman who was going to be his wife and for her family. And we imagine him struggling with that and trying to decide what to do. And Scripture tells us that Joseph thought about it and he reasoned it through. And he decided that he would not bring shame to Mary and her family, but instead he would divorce her quietly and just release her to the care of her family and let it go. Joseph was a righteous man. Joseph was a good man. He was a kind man. He was a merciful man. And he was all of those things before the angel ever came to him and told him what to do. But the angel did come. The angel did come. And when the angel came, the angel called Joseph by name. Not just his first name, but by his full name. Joseph, son of David. Remember what that was like when your mother called you by your full name? Got your attention, didn't it? I remember that. I remember my mother saying, "Lorianne Van Sickle." Oh, and it meant I had better pay attention. But you know, I've been thinking about that this week, and I've been thinking about why we do that. I've been thinking about why my mother did that. What did she mean when she called me by my full name? And you know, I think she meant more than just, "Missy, are you ever in trouble now?" I think she meant more than that. I think when my mother called me by my full name, she was reminding me of who I am. I think when my mother said, "Lorianne Van Sickle," she was saying to me, "You remember who you are. You are a Van Sickle. You are a member of this family, and we have certain expectations of you. We have certain standards for behavior in this family, and when you misbehave, it's not just about you. It reflects on all of us as a family." Lorianne Van Sickle, remember who and whose you are. And so the angel appears to Joseph, and the angel calls him and says, "Joseph, son of David," reminding Joseph that he is a member of the house of David. Joseph was part of a long history of people who had this special relationship with God, of people whom God had chosen as his instrument in the world to fulfill his purposes. And generations before, God had chosen David to be the king over all of Israel. God loved David. And God promised David that his reign would last forever and that his kingdom would never end. In 2 Samuel, God says to David, "When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring, and I will establish his kingdom forever. Your house and your kingdom will be made sure forever. Your throne shall be established forever." And Joseph was a descendant of the house of David. And now, the angel says, "Now, son of David, now is your moment. Now is your time to participate in God's plan for all of humanity by taking Mary as your wife and by naming this child Jesus." Jesus is the fulfillment of that ancient prophecy. Jesus is the eternal King of the house of David. There's just one problem with that, right? Jesus wasn't Joseph's son. Jesus wasn't part of that bloodline of the house of David. Biologically, Jesus wasn't descended from the house of David. Biologically, Joseph wasn't Jesus' father. But we know that there's more to being a father than biology, don't we? And Joseph knew that too. In verses 24 and 25, we read, "When Joseph woke up, he did as the angel commanded him, and he took Mary as his wife, and she gave birth to a son, and Joseph gave him the name Jesus." You see, then as now, naming the baby was very, very important. The name Jesus means the Lord saves. That name is important. But there's more to it than just the name. In naming the baby, Joseph declares that this child belongs to him. In effect, Joseph adopts Jesus and thus incorporates Jesus into the line of the house of David. Now see, I think that's so interesting. That the prophecy is fulfilled not through bloodline, but through adoption. Those of us who have been involved in adoption, who know people who have adopted children, who have been involved in adopting children, perhaps ourselves, who have stepchildren who maybe we haven't officially adopted, but they are our stepchildren and we have essentially adopted them and claimed them as our own. We know, don't we, what a blessing and what a privilege that is, and how special those children and those relationships are. Several years ago, I don't know if they're still doing it or when they stopped doing it. But CBS News used to do a little feature called Everybody Has a Story. Do you remember those? I think the correspondent's name was Steve Henson, maybe? And what he would do is he would throw a dart at a map, and wherever the dart landed, he would go to that town. And when he got to the town, he'd go find a public phone book, and he'd do this, and whatever name his finger landed on, he would go visit that family, and he would ask them what their story was. And his whole point was, everybody has a story. Okay? Well, it just so happens that one of those episodes occurred about Christmas time, and it is a story about adoption. And so we're going to watch that video clip now. Michaela's going to pull it up for us, and we're going to watch this video. Watch and see.
Westmoreland County. Here we go. The toughest part about picking people at random and telling their stories is that most people have no idea what their story is. Isaac.
Sometimes I think I'm boring, and sometimes I think I'm a nobody, and what could anybody be interested in my life?
Well, just give me a minute.
Let's go.
Susie Izat lives with her husband Jim and their 3 strong helpers, Joey, Dennis, and Josh.
Wow.
Their family is a Norman Rockwell painting come to life.
There it is.
And yet, time was when Susie couldn't have dreamed of a Christmas like this.
Okay, ready, go, man. Good. Don't let that over.
I had a hysterectomy on my 25th birthday, actually.
25th?
25th birthday, yeah.
Susie and Jim adopted Josh 5 years later, but decided not to adopt again because the waiting list was so long, choosing instead
You can't catch me.
to become foster parents.
Can you put into words why you like it here so much?
Because they love us and they snuggle us.
They snuggle you.
And he's a snuggle bug.
We fell in love with these kids, and I think it's obvious why we did it.
The 2 brothers used to live here in McKeesport, Pennsylvania, an old depressed steel mill town. They first went into foster care about 3 years ago because of neglect. And Susie says when she first met them, they had almost animal-like behavior. They would claw at people. They weren't properly toilet trained, and they didn't know how to use silverware.
They have come incredibly far.
Not only do they now know how to use silverware,
That was good night.
Chopsticks?
Yes.
You know how to use those?
Yes.
the boys have scrapbooks full of their new adventures.
This is my first tree-eyed car in my life. I love this page.
Obviously, even though the boys don't officially belong to this family, Susie and Jim have tried to make them feel a part of it. Which is why Joey and Dennis say they have just one last favor to ask of the Isaacs.
Can I be adopted?
Is that your one wish?
Yes.
When Susie first found out she couldn't have kids, she told herself God must have a better plan. Now, 15 years later, she says she knows what it is.
The love that we have in our family is more than I ever want. It's so fulfilling. It's so good.
Pass this over to Joe. Pass it to me.
So, Joey, to answer your question, yes, you will both be adopted, just as soon as the judge signs the papers.
Like that one?
And that's the story of the boring woman from Pennsylvania,
Perfect.
who thinks she's a nobody, with absolutely nothing interesting going on in her life. Steve Harmon, CBS News.
You and I are those children. And God has adopted us into His family. You know, I see so many people who wander through life like spiritual orphans, feeling like God could not possibly love them, feeling like there's no place for them in the church, feeling like there is no community of faith where they can be accepted. We are children of God. All people are children of God. God desires to take us and to adopt us into God's own family. And when God does that, God gives us a new name. And that name is child of God. And so my wish for you this Christmas, over the next couple of days, is that you will listen for the angel. Listen for the angel to come and to call you by your full name. Mary Channel, daughter of God. Jim Hayes, son of God. Edith McLean, daughter of God. For that is who we are. We are children of God, and God has adopted us into His chosen family. And that all happens by His great love that comes down to us at Christmas. Thanks be to God.